Thanks, Joe.
Okay, great. All right, again, welcome everybody. This is a task 2 review for the Duxbury and Snug Harbor Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. We recently submitted the task 2 memo to MVP, which completed the vulnerability assessment portion of the project. And yeah, I think you should have all received that for review. I'm going to kind of touch on the highlights of it in this presentation, and we can open it up to discussion and questions. So just a quick review of where we came from and where we are. So the town is an MVP certified community, which came about through some planning with MAPC that was a little bit ahead of the MVP program. So Duxbury was pre-certified in the MVP program. Some of the relevant hazards for this project that were addressed in this initial assessment were sea level rise and storm surge. Important actions were adaptation for the town, as well as vulnerable areas, which included Snug Harbor, as well as a couple others that we will look at today, Gurnett Road and Bluefish River. Looking at zoning, regulatory, incentive mitigation and cooperative approaches. So there will be an assessment of regulatory opportunities as part of the final report. We're still doing that analysis right now. And some ideas about design standards for raising roads. So there is a road vulnerability assessment built into this project, and we will probably be talking about ways those can be approved and addressed, improved and addressed, and that will likely refer to some of the design guidelines coming out at the state level. So just to remind us, we are currently vulnerable to flooding, as you all know, especially down in the Snug Harbor area. This is the flooding in 2018, I believe, across Washington Street. So this project incorporates 3 phases. In the first phase, which was task 1, we chose planning scenarios, which were present day 2030 and 2070. And we did our asset survey and gathered locations and critical elevations of those assets. This phase, task 2, we completed the asset consequence scoring, mapped the probability, looked at natural resources change over time, and completed the risk assessment. So this matrix on the right here is showing you that we're taking a risk-based approach, which uses probability of inundation as well as consequence. So what happens if something floods and it's not a big deal, you shouldn't have to worry about it. But if something has a high probability of flooding and has a high consequence, high impacts on the town, and we'll talk about what those impacts are in a little bit, then that should be prioritized for planning and adaptation, which is the next step in this process. Here's a view of all the assets that we documented. A lot of them, as you can see, are concentrated. This is both public and private. So the assets with the red outlines are private Snug Harbor properties, and the ones with the blue outlines are Ducktown and Duxbury. So a lot of concentration in Snug Harbor and in the Bluefish River. In total, we looked at a whole bunch of road segments, 320, a number of bridges, buildings, other infrastructure, parking lots, and some coastal infrastructure and open space. Similarly with Snug Harbor, buildings, parking lots, piers, and other infrastructure. So we had 2 different ways of assessing the consequence of inundation. This was sort of the standard set of criteria that we used to judge and rate consequence of flooding for the town, the municipal assets. So it looks at how wide the impact would be across the town, how long it would take to recover from that damage, and how much it would cost to either repair or replace, depending on the level of damage. And then it looks at the town's ability to provide services, basically public impacts on public safety and emergency services, impacts on economic activity, and impacts on health and environment. For the Snug Harbor assets, for the business community, the first three criteria were the same. The second three looked at impacts on business operations and planning. So impacts on economic activity of the business, marketing and outreach, and business planning. So how do those assets support your business as a whole? So we're going to look at sea level rise and storm surge. First, we're going to look at sea level rise, and then we're going to look at sea level rise and storm surge together. So these are the sea level rise projections that have been released by the state, approved by CZM, and published for use in the MVP program. As you'll see, that they track between a likely and a high scenarios. So it's a conservative estimate, and these timelines aren't set in stone. But it's useful to look at them for planning purposes. What may end up happening is that what you see by 2070 may be the 2050 number. That all depends on the science of glacial ice sheet loss and those contributions, which are still a little bit uncertain, as well as the emissions pathways that we end up taking as a global community. So the state is planning between the RCP 4.5 and 8.5, which is sort of moderate reduction to business as usual. So these are sort of the baseline of numbers that we used for the tidal projections that we used for Snug Harbor. Now, what does that mean for natural resources? So we looked at the sea level rise affecting marshes model, which Woods Hole Group developed for CZM a few years back. And what we found overall in terms of a trend here was that 75% of the existing high marsh in the town is projected to convert to low marsh in the long term. So I'm going to step through the map on the right-hand side here. So we got present day, 2030, 2070. So there's that big conversion from low marsh to high marsh. Sorry, high marsh to low marsh. So as the tide is rising, those species that are used to having less exposure to the tide are exposed to more frequent tidal inundation, and there's sort of a conversion in that habitat. The other thing that we found was that there's approximately 293 acres of additional open water in that same time frame. And that comes from both loss of the low marsh as well as some conversion from upland areas as the tide rises. What does that mean from an infrastructure perspective? So up on the right, top right corner, you'll see tidal projections, which are based on those sea level rise projections before, but specific to Duxbury Bay, developed from MCFRM results. So these are elevations in NAVD 88 for a number of tidal benchmarks. And what I've mapped here for Snug Harbor is the mean higher high water over time. 2030 in blue doesn't look like much of a change from present. It's kind of creeping up the seawall here, but overall the normal daily use condition is pretty similar to what exists today. The 2050 projection, which would be up to 7.8 feet in AVD 88, you get a little bit of encroachment here at the Matakeesit parking lot up through the boat ramp, and some right at the top of this old wetland area here, some some tidal inundation through the bayside area. A little bit of fringe flooding down here by Island Creek. And I think the really notable thing here, obviously, is that the 2070 projection, which would be up to 9.7 feet in AVD 88, really makes a lot of this area not very viable given the current configuration and elevations, because we've got tidal inundation coming across most of the Snug Harbor area up to Sweetsers on the backside and potentially even across Washington Street. So long term, depending on when this all plays out and if it gets to this magnitude, there's some serious issues for Snug Harbor. So that's sea level rise. Now, just reminding ourselves what we're looking at for storm surge. The data that we're using, the projections that we're using for combined effects of sea level rise and storm surge come from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, which instead of this bathtub approach that you see on the right here, which is like a 12.2 NAVD 88 storm visualization, uses a hydrodynamic approach where rather than flat water surface, we're considering winds, waves, tides, all of the relevant physical processes. This happens to be a nor'easter that's pushing water up on the South Shore. Same storm. So again, it's looking at sea level rise, changing climate conditions, more frequent and more intense storms. And what we get out of that model is primarily flood probabilities. So that's the probability that a portion of the land will get inundated by a storm in any given year at that planning horizon. So it's an annual probability. From that, because we have elevation and bathymetry built into the model, we can look at inundation depths for any probability storm. And for this project, I believe we selected the 1% storm and the 0.2% storm. No, sorry, the 0.5% storm. So the 100-year event and the 200-year recurrence interval. This is the extent of our model in Duxbury, and the resolution is pretty high. So at every intersection in that grid, we're calculating water levels. So here are the results. This is, as I step through, we're going to see probability present day, 2030, and 2070. There are also 2050 results now available, and we're starting to work on 2100. But for this project, we were looking at present day, 2030, 2070. So those probabilities range from 0.1% in the pink all the way down this rainbow here through down to up to 100%. So 100% probability doesn't necessarily mean it's wet every day of the year. It just means that the annual storm will inundate that area. So right now there's some flooding that's coming through the Bluefish River, up around in the marshes over here. As we know, across Duxbury Beach. And obviously there's some inundation south of Marshall Street here through these tidal creeks. And some flooding that we've already experienced here in Snug Harbor. So that's present day. 2030, you're going to see some expansion and some higher probabilities. So now we have some potential flooding, very low probability across Harrison Street, more in the Snug Harbor and Washington Street area. More of a connection here across, I think this is King Caesar Road. Similarly, down here by Marshall Street, some more higher probability flooding, and certainly higher probabilities across Duxbury Beach. And 2070, again, more extensive, higher probability. So then I think I just included the 1% depths here, but in the technical memo, you can also look at the 0.5% depths. So this is the depth of flooding in a current day 100-year event, in a 2030 100-year event, and in a 2070 1% 100-year event. And those range from like half a foot to 10 feet or more. I think that the important thing to note here is that while there are some locations where we've got inundation going across roadways and through the tidal creeks, topography of Duxbury in general is very beneficial. So there's a point at which elevation of the landform just stops coastal flooding, which is a good thing. And you'll see in some of the asset evaluations, there's a lot of assets in Duxbury that aren't exposed, even over the long term. So how do we evaluate that? We grab a node, which is a calculation point in that model, from MCFRM, and that gives us water surface elevations and probabilities, and we chart those. So we have present day, 2030, 2050, 2070, and we compare those water surface elevations to the critical elevations in the assets that we've evaluated. So these dotted lines here, I looked at some Snug Harbor infrastructure, is the elevation of the decking at the town pier, which is just under 9 feet. The kind of finished floor of the harbor master's office, which is just above 10 feet in ABD 88. And the critical elevation for the shared septic system in Snug Harbor, which is, I'll have to double check, but I believe it was entry point at the top in one of the covers of that system. That was about 11.5, just shy of 11.5. So what we're looking for is the intersection between our projections and those critical elevations. So for instance, the harbor master's office has a very low probability of flooding in today and 2030s conditions. By 2050 projections, it looks like about a 20% annual chance of inundation. And by 2070, much larger, between, we sort of bin these probabilities. So I think in the tables that you saw, it probably is reporting as 100% chance, although it's a little bit less. Here's an example from Powder Point Bridge where we looked at the structural elements, so the west and the east abutments, as well as the decking, which are about almost 1.5 feet above that. So either the surface of the bridge or the structural, lowest of the structural elements. It has a little peak, as you know, at the top. So that again has, fairly low chance of flooding right now, but those probabilities increase over time, where the east abutment sort of has a 40% chance by 2050, and 100% chance of inundation by 2070. So when we take that probability and the consequence that we've scored, we get risk. So these next set of maps are the risk assessment. They're scored from 1,000 to 10,000 because we have probabilities from 0 to 100 and consequence scores from 0 to 100. So you just multiply those two together to get risk. And it hopefully helps you focus on certain areas for adaptation in both time and space. Another thing to note on this map is that you'll see some things outlined in black with no color coding, and that means it received a zero risk, which means it either has no chance of flooding, no consequence of flooding, which is primarily for a lot of the open space in the marshes, or both no chance and no consequence. And what you'll see, I think, is that especially here in Bluefish River area by the high school complex and the library, there's no exposure. That those zero risk scores are actually because there's zero probability of flooding. And then, once you go further up to the west, the facilities that we did include in the evaluation also have 0% chance of flooding. And there's even more town infrastructure that is well above the area that our model even takes into account. So present day risk is primarily concentrated in Snug Harbor. There's a couple bridges here and there that have a sort of a low risk, but it exists. 2030, very similar conditions, but slightly elevated risk in the Marshall Street Bridge and some public and private infrastructure in Snug Harbor. I think the other thing that you see here is that the Powder Point Bridge has a moderate level of risk by 2030. By 2070, those risks jump up because the elevations of that inundation has jumped up as well. So what I really noticed was, again, Snug Harbor and the bridges. So we've got Island Creek Bridge down on the southwest, and then Marshall Street. I forget the name of this one.
Is that the Harrison Street, and then is that one up there? Is that Canal Street Bridge?
This is Canal Street Bridge, yeah.
Okay.
Each street bridge is not on the map, but it's in the tables. So all of these bridges were assessed based on the road surface elevation. We're going out next week to do a survey of the critical elevations for the structure themselves, but those will be lower, so that will make these risk scores higher. But right now we're evaluating bridges on a access scale only. So some of these assets down here in the Bluefish River area by the high school, it's I think there was this is a playing field, and then there was a couple little pieces of infrastructure. So if memory serves, it's the first lift station at the high school for the septic, the generator, and in Alden, there's a low entry point at the south end of Alden Elementary. But the rest of the buildings and infrastructure in that area are high and dry.
That's good.
Yeah, very good. So this is another way of looking at those results. These are the risk scores for the town assets. I just took the top 25. We can come back to this and discuss it, but really a lot of Snug Harbor infrastructure is in here and some bridges. And Snug Harbor private assets, I also took the top 25. This probably makes more sense for you to review internally rather than across all organizations, because you each did your consequence scoring for yourselves. So the consequence scores aren't necessarily comparable across the board, but at least points you to high probability and high risk assets. and we can go back and discuss these as well. But I will also be providing each of the Snug Harbor businesses and the town with profile sheets for each asset, which will report these risk scores, the probability scores, the critical elevation that's based on, and the full distribution of water surface elevation. So you can really dig into the data on an asset by asset basis. But just going through the high level results for this right now. Roads. So I separated roads for the presentation because there's so many road segments. There's like 320, and it's kind of easier to think about roads versus buildings and other infrastructure. So what you see here is similarly scored risk scores for road segments, and they go through the same time frame. So present day, 2030, 2070. And no surprise, there's high risk on the road, Burnett Road across Duxbury Beach. There is an ongoing project that I know Chris is aware of and leading to address a lot of that vulnerability and risk. The other ones that jump up are Washington Street, Harrison Street, King Caesar, and St. George to some extent, as well as parts of the low-lying parts of Bay Road, which are tidal crossings. So that is the risk results. What we're planning to do next is kind of take some feedback from the group, look at the concentration of risk and assets that are at risk, and develop some adaptation recommendations. And so what the areas that we're planning to focus on are, by default, because of this project, our Snug Harbor, but we'll also be looking for other areas to develop adaptation plans for. It seems to me like bridges are going to be big, bridges and some roads. Access seems to be a big connection risk across the town based on what I've seen, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that. And so here's an example of what MAPC started to think about in terms of adaptation for Snug Harbor. We'll be refining this, developing it a little bit further, making it a little more specific in terms of elevations and planning horizons. This is a good starting point. So that's the summary. So as I said, again, the next thing we're getting ready to do is develop some conceptual level adaptation plans, both for infrastructure and for natural resources. Complete the review and recommendations for local regulations, and submit the final report.
This is great. I'm hoping that some of the stakeholders on this call can participate in maybe specific asset-based discussions, and then we would have like the Snug Harbor group. Maybe we break it down by asset and the most near-term concerns, so we can set up little miniature task force groups.
Sure. Yeah, I can send out, if you don't already have it, we can send out these spreadsheets, so you can dig down into it, and we should have the asset profiles ready pretty soon. They're just being produced right now.
I think a big deal for us is because the harbor is so critical to, having JR there, having a boat access, and also the investments being made by the yacht club and DBMS in terms of the waterfront. Our hope is that we can start to really focus on an improvement timeline and, maybe as an outcome, start to strategize around additional grant applications to help us, narrow down what we can do that would be, structurally achievable to maintain access to the water for the public, both through private and public access at this Mount Harbor location. Because I think that's, I met with our new director who's joined us from DBMS and also the waterfront coordinator at the yacht club, and they're both actually looking at long-term planning right now. So this is very good timing.
Great. Yeah, I've seen other communities take advantage of Seaport economic grants, which would probably be a good fit here.
Mm-hmm.
I know Woods Hole and the town of Falmouth went in together on one to do a similar vulnerability assessment that we're doing, but it could be used for additional planning and design that looked at buoy and MBL and NOAA's infrastructure.
And maybe we can work with Peter on, maybe we look at other grants for, timing and what we need to pull together in terms of costs to do as we go forward. And this may be things we have to add to the next scope. The next project would be, how do we achieve design for the Powder Point Bridge that's going to work with these numbers? How do we work with Mass DOT when it comes to the bridges and risk, and how do we factor that in as we move forward? And then, of course, as you mentioned, the road elevations to try to maintain access. And in some cases, I think there's only one or two homes that are affected by some of these, but in other cases, it's whole neighborhoods. And when do we start? A question I think Greg and I have is, when do we start talking about retreat versus infrastructure maintenance and liability for the towns in terms of what they do moving forward as well? And I know that's been a topic that's been brought up a few times through the folks at MEPC. Like, if we don't maintain the roads, at that point liable for for being sued and that kind of thing is something we're increasingly concerned about. So
the retreat thing is something that communities are starting to think about and address in different ways, either regulatorily or just sort of pulling back services for roads that are, repeatedly impacted. In other cases, like working waterfronts where you need to be at the water's edge, it's not really phased retreat, but sort of making sure that there's sufficient elevation, to enable daily access while making sure that the infrastructure around the waterfront is resilient to storm impacts.
Okay.
So those are kind of the things that we're going to be thinking about. Part of the adaptation component of this is to develop, very conceptual level costs, estimated costs for whatever recommendations we make. And the comment about timing, Val, is a really good one. We can give some general recommendations here, but another thing that's sort of a larger project that we've done with other communities is what we call these adaptation pathways, where we look at different approaches to maintaining resilience for groups of assets or individual assets, and there may be some things that you can do up to a certain point, but beyond that, it doesn't make sense to keep throwing resources at it in the same way. And so where are those tipping points at which point you should no longer, maybe it doesn't make sense to support a road, or maybe it makes sense to transition from a more natural and green infrastructure approach to a more hardened solution. We can definitely start thinking about that here. Might not be able to flesh it all out in this assessment.
Yeah.
Idea.
That's great. I mean, I think this is going exactly where we were hoping. I'm wondering what other people are thinking. There's so many other guests.
Yeah, I see Chris raising her hand. Do you have a question, Chris?
I just wanted to tag off what you just said, Joe, and thank you for this. I'm cutting and pasting and writing down your notes. I know it's recorded, but that was fabulous. I'll have to do that 5 more times now.
We can send you the technical memo so you can have it all.
Yeah, no, this was a lot easier. This is the cheating way, is to pretend to read that and then just listen to you. So I appreciate the layman's explanation on some of the modeling that was presented in the report. So I say this out loud for my own benefit. So right now where DVR is doing exactly what you said. What makes the most sense? And we are in this area. What really concerns me about this is the assumption that there's no breach in Duxbury Beach, and that, you know, sea level rise is obviously happening and we have storm surge, but you know, I don't know how many folks know that we had 12 overwash areas, 3 of significance. That would be 4 feet of water in the road. I would call it like a class 2, 3 current running across last week ago Tuesday.
Is that a recreational opportunity?
Huh?
Is that a recreational opportunity?
Right, yeah, exactly. No, it was, do I drive the truck through and just hear like one of those idiots where you watch on the news and go, what were they thinking? So right now I'm trying to figure out, of the 4.5 miles, what am I going to say I'm comfortable with losing? So it's literally a mark in the sand, if you will, of anything south of this. It's going to happen, and I'm not going to put money into it. And what I'm doing is literally, if you will, figuratively and literally standing on the dune and looking west and saying, okay, that's Snug Harbor. All right, so that's Powder Point. We're going to maintain that section. But as I go further south, I sit there and say, can I see Standish Shores, or is Clark's Island in the way? And that would be the next, you know, the fetch would continue, and then hopefully the energy absorption would happen on the east facing side of Clark's Island. So
based on the assumption that there's a nor'easter and you're the town's line of defense.
I mean, I am, unless I'm full of myself. I'm looking at this chart going, just as long as it's there, you know, and I see I'm number 10 on the town for the parking lot. I'm not actually, I'm in the municipal chart, which I don't want to change if that helps me partner and get grants. But right now I'm in talks with FEMA trying to explain that we're in this decision, and I'm sitting here as a private organization trying to decide which parts of the town I will no longer be able to protect. I mean, because my whole mission is literally to maintain the landform to protect the coastline. And let me tell you, that's a hell of a decision to make.
Chris, are you talking south of High Pines?
I am.
Yeah,
I am. I mean, and I have to say that this conversation, you know, this is a strategy. I'm not speaking like this decision has been made, but this is my next step. This is we're going into strategy mode. We've just changed our structure internally, and starting on April 19th, it's going to be where is that line in the sand? Where do I stop adding? Because it's exactly what Joe said, of you've got to make that decision at some point, and the reservation is at that point. And, you know, we don't have the funding we did before for emergencies. We're not going to get any emergency funding. FEMA has changed it, so now it's a little bit more proactive, which is great. But so I just throw a little, warning out there that that strip of land might not be in its entirety, and I'm very confident that that's an accurate statement. I won't be putting sand in certain locations anymore. So if there's an overwash, it turns into a breach. It turns into a breach. That's what will happen.
Yeah, I think we all agree. And is there something we can do to help you with those decisions in terms of, maybe we get more funding to look at where it's going to breach and what the impacts are?
I think that Woods Hole's done quite a bit of that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
I think Kirk would freak if we asked him again, but we know where our big titles, certain energy is, where our wave energy is offshore. We know where that is across from High Pines, as well as between crossover 1 and 2, which is where we just addressed. We have a multi-million-dollar project, and that's like a piece of it right now. We have a $1.4 million project coming up at Duxbury Beach Park, but that price is created by the width, because it's all sand for us. 96% of our cost is sand. So 1.4 is going to get me this much. If I want to go out just even 100 feet on either side, that's going to increase my cost.
Oh, Chris,
Right.
sorry.
Sorry.
Part of that assessment and planning that you've been doing with Kirk and Elise and others, did that include a coastal processes study?
It did.
Yeah. Okay. So we have the modeling that
Is required.
That talks about all of that. And what I'd say about these flood maps is that they do assume some erosion of the landform by the 2070 time horizon. It's an estimate. It's not, it's not based on, well, it's based on past events, I think. But I'm pretty sure that it's built into this, but obviously, there are going to be events between now and 2070 that change the landform.
Right. I mean, the big difference between the past and now is that when those big events happened, the reservation put the dune back. And that's because we had that emergency FEMA funding. So if, I have 3 more marches like I did in 2018. I mean, that was a hit of almost $1 million for those 3 storms in 2 weeks. We just by the grace of Mother Nature, we didn't have anything for the last 2 years. But if I get hit with anything like that, and I'm concerned that folks on the phone, never mind in the town, don't understand that we're not going to be able to put the dune back together. The funding isn't there. That wasn't because we raised all the money. It's because FEMA came in with emergency funding, and they've shut us off since 2005 on that. So I just, I'm not trying to be a Chicken Little. I'm just like right now, and I don't know who in the town, Valerie is obviously well aware, but you have a private organization really deciding where to put our funding and where it's best spent. And clearly we want input from the town, but it also has to do with, we're also in 2 towns.
Right.
And I'm not really speaking about the other town. I'm wholeheartedly, I should be given like an honorary residency to Duxbury. We'll talk about that later, Rainey. But that doesn't even come into play. As far as I'm concerned, that's off the plate right now anyways. But so I've said my piece. I just want to let everybody know that, I don't want to be the person that throws a big wrench into these plants, but at some point you're going to have more water coming through, and it's not going to be sealed up.
Yeah, so it's important. It's an important point to make, is that if something happens in the near to midterm to DBR, these maps might not reflect the reality and severity of flooding, because assumption in this model is that erosion occurs in the long term.
Right. This model doesn't assume storms like hurricanes at all, right?
No, it does. It does. There's hurricanes and nor'easters built into the suite of storms that go through the probabilistic statistics assessment here, but the actual assumption about change in the landform doesn't occur until a further out time horizon.
Okay, because we think it's probably closer to like a 10-year horizon or less, given the constancy of the breaches.
Right. So what Chris is doing is the right thing to do. She's kind of looking west to see what wave she can, wave approach she can protect on Duxbury.
Okay.
Chris, I will make sure our selectmen, I have to talk to them tonight anyway. They're aware, because I think a lot of people in Marshfield assume that Duxbury Beach will always be there.
Thanks, exactly. I think we're our own worst enemy for the reservation, and they've done a really good job of putting that dune back together every single time. That it's just history is my enemy right now.
Yeah, and I think that expectation is still alive and well in Duxbury for the most part.
Right.
They're doing a lot of planning, assuming that is going to be there as an asset, and Plymouth is not reacting, and CVM is telling us that they're just going to keep giving you money to fix it, but you have to keep coming up with a local match, and it's not realistic.
Right. I mean, I lost 6 feet off my dune just south of Blakeman's. 6 feet in elevation. So that literally just wiped out my parking lot. And past Plum Hills, I lost 4 feet and 4 feet. And when I speak, I talk about elevation now. So.
And that was last week, right?
Yeah, that was that little storm. And yes, I did drive through the puddle. It was a class 3 rapid. Maybe I shouldn't have driven through. We'll see.
Okay. I think we need to get like the emergency response people, the select boards, and talk about it, because I think we're talking about it, but I mean, we're making decisions now and design decisions now and infrastructure decisions now, both at the town levels, but also state infrastructure and, big money that we might get for these grants to try to keep up infrastructure. So it's really a lot of state money. And we need to all be on the same page about where we're headed with all this, so that we're making good decisions.
I think Joe's idea about the Seaport grant, I tried to get one. I tried to use everybody on the phone as the excuse of why I needed it. But it didn't work. They won't consider me a seaport. But I think that figuring out, and I know some of this was done with Snug Harbor about the actual costs of money and economic importance, and using that, they can do whole evaluations a lot deeper than what was done for the MVP part for Snug Harbor. And then that puts you up for additional money if you get that Seaport grant.
I think we've been encouraged by EEA. Is it EEA? There's somebody that lives in Duxbury that's been encouraging us to do that study. And now we have some real data telling us, that we need to do it now in order to do decisions. We should be working on a grant like that, so that we can make decisions.
Yeah, it was the EEA that approached me. They came and met with me. And we had a Zoom call about trying to get folks in the Duxbury area. So I can only encourage that, as I said, because I tried to go for it myself and they shot me down. But you obviously have a really good case.
Yeah. Okay. So I think
could leverage off that, because then I could say the barrier beach protects everything that's covered. So basically I just wait till the last page of the report and use that for grants as well.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm sorry to take up so much time.
No, thank you for your comments, Chris.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
really, really helpful stuff, Jeff. This is great.
Sure. So if there aren't any other questions or comments, I think my next plan, in addition to sending you all the asset profiles, will be to sort of come up with I guess a bucket list of priorities in our eyes and see if that squares with yours. Unless anybody has some specific suggestions. I think we all know that Snug Harbor is a big one. We all know that DBR is an important piece of the puzzle, but there's some other areas that might need some attention as well. So I can put together that list and circulate it for review if that makes sense. I'm very interested in your own input. So if there's something on this list or on these maps that once you take some time and sit with it and review it, that sort of jumps on your radar and you say, yeah, we should probably be looking at this area or this asset or this road, please let us know.
That'd be really helpful.
Great. So that's all I have. So again, we've completed task 2 of the MVP grant. We'll be moving on to adaptation in these next few months, and then submitting the final report. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions or follow-up.
I think, yeah, I think a question for the group. We've got it recorded, and I'm thinking of just sending a link to the people that were invited or are in the meeting. I don't really want to make this a broad public statement until we've had more time to digest it and think about where we're headed with this. And maybe we need to have a meeting just with the Snug Harbor Business Group, in a week or two to sort of start to figure out how they want to approach it as well, and try to. So I'll be reaching back out to everyone to continue to follow up and keep Joe in the loop too.
And then once we have some consensus about where we're going with knowing what we know now, the last part of task 2 is the public meeting. So that would be, I think, Val, we plan to do that for the selectmen. Yeah, and we have 5 in a few weeks. We'll go up to 5. So we want to definitely wait until we have the new board in place. So sounds good. Great. Thank you all.
Thanks, Joe. This
Thanks,
is super
Joe.
helpful.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks,
It really
Joe.
is. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.